Hello, everyone. I'm Dominic Preziosi, editor of Commonweal. Thank you for attending this live virtual presentation of Commonweal's John Garvey Conversations, Spirituality in a Time of Reckoning. We're happy to have you here for the first of our three-part series, exploring how our individual and collective spiritual experiences might move us toward a place of transformation and healing after a year in which the accumulation of loss, isolation, and division has for many people been difficult to understand and to respond to. Today's Spirituality in a Time of Reckoning panel will feature a discussion on grief. I'm very happy to have with us as our featured speakers, Nancy Pineda-Madrid of Loyola Marymount University and Monsignor Arturo Bañuelas of the Diocese of El Paso. The conversation will be moderated by Claudia Avila Cosnahan, Commonweal Magazine's Director of Mission and Partnerships. Claudia has also served as Director of Evangelization at the Cathedral of Our Lady of the Angels in downtown Los Angeles, and is a frequent retreat leader, speaker, and instructor for adult formation programs. In just a moment, Claudia will introduce you to our panelists. But first, I want to invite everyone who's here with us to be here for the next 2 Thursdays as well. On June 17th and June 24th at the same time, when we'll be presenting discussions on righteous anger and on metanoia. If you've registered for this event, it means you're registered for the next 2 as well. I also want to let everyone know that all of the conversations in this series will be available for later viewing on YouTube if you'd like to watch again, or if you're not able to attend live. Just a couple more housekeeping items. As part of the webinar settings, your video and microphone are turned off. The chat's also disabled, so please direct all questions to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And if you have a technical question, also send it through the Q&A. Commonweal staff will be monitoring it, and they'll be able to answer your questions. I'd also like to offer this reminder about our Commonweal events. They are free and they're open to the public, and they wouldn't be possible without our readers and subscribers. Their support and encouragement, the support and encouragement we get from friends and readers of Commonweal are indispensable. If our independent lay-run voice matters to you, we invite you to support us with a tax-deductible donation. Just see the donate link in the chat feature or go to our website. You can also be a part of the conversation by subscribing to the magazine, signing up for our newsletters, listening to our podcast, and following us on social media. Your help's a big part in everything we do. I also have to thank the folks here at Commonweal who've put this series of events together, especially our audience development team, Milton Javier Bravo, Gabriella Wilkie, and Adriana Melnick, along with our publisher, Tom Baker. And finally, let me thank those who've agreed to take part today, our moderator and our panelists, and all of you for joining us. So now, without further ado, I hand things over to Claudia Avila Cosnahan.
Thank you, Dominic, and welcome. It is my honor to welcome our 2 guests. Nancy Pineda-Madrid is the T. Marie Chilton Chair of Catholic Theology at Loyola Marymount University. Previously, she was the Associate Professor of Theology and Ministry at Boston College. Dr. Pineda-Madrid holds a PhD in Systematic and Philosophical Theology from the Graduate Theological Union and an MDiv from Seattle University. She is the first theologian to publish a book on the evil of feminicide, titled Suffering and Salvation in Ciudad Juarez from Fortress Press, arguing that this tragedy demands a fresh consideration of what salvation means. In addition, she has co-edited 2 books, Hope, Promise, Possibility, and Fulfillment, and The Holy Spirit, Setting the World on Fire, both from Paulus Press. She has published numerous articles addressing questions of salvation, suffering, religious symbols, popular Catholicism, and Latina feminist theology. In addition to English, her work has been published in German, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian. She has given public lectures at universities across the US, as well as Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, El Salvador, India, Austria, Germany, and Canada. She is former president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States, ACTUS, and former vice president of the International Network of Societies of Catholic Theology, INSECT. She is the 2018 recipient of the Ann O'Hara Graf Memorial Award, given by the Catholic Theological Society of America's Women's Consultation in Constructive Theology. Our second panelist is Arturo Bañuelas. He is the pastor of St. Mark's Parish in the Diocese of El Paso, Texas. Formerly, he served as pastor of St. Pius X, which was identified as an outstanding parish in the national survey by Paul Wilkes and Excellent Catholic Parishes by Paulus Press. After earning his doctorate from the Gregorian University in Rome in 1988, he was the founding director of the Tepeyac Institute, a diocesan ministry formation center. The institute is one of the largest in the nation, training laity for parish ministry, and is distinctive with its formation shaped by the reality of the border. Monsignor Bañuelas has been widely recognized and honored for his advocacy on behalf of farm workers, immigrants, and for his work on issues of life and justice at the border. He is a popular speaker and teacher who addresses topics of theology, faith, and politics with various civic, academic, religious, pastoral, and health organizations. Monsignor Bañuelas has founded a number of initiatives in theology, ministry, and border activism over the past 40 years. He was co-founder of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States, ACTUS, and most recently established the Hope Border Institute, which focused on justice issues in the 3 border dioceses of El Paso, Texas, Las Cruces, New Mexico, and Juarez, Mexico. Welcome, and thank you for joining Commonweal this day. So today, and for the next 3 weeks, we will gather once a week for Commonweal's John Garvey Conversation series on spirituality in a time of reckoning. We reflect on Pope Francis' early invitation in 2020 to see the era we are living in now as a place of metanoia. This pandemic era is indelibly marked by grief. And so today, we begin by reflecting on the spirituality of grief. We speak of looking forward to a post-pandemic reality, but it feels as though the loss and grief of 2020 and 2021 keeps us tied to the pandemic past and present. So Dr. Nancy Pineda-Madrid and Monsignor Arturo Bañuelas, your theological and ministerial work has placed you amid suffering even before the pandemic and now through it. Can you describe what grieving has looked like in the past year? How maybe it's compared to contemporary experiences of trauma or grief? What are we grieving?
Nancy, okay, I'll start. These past 14 months have been a real struggle and a lot of sorrow for many people because they went to experiences that they never thought they were going to have to go through in their lives. There's a lady who lost her son and her husband. And she says, I'm grieving so much I can hardly breathe. Some of the difficult things about this year was not being able to be with family. It was an immense grief. Christmas alone, Easter, all those holidays. We had Zooms with family gatherings, but you can't hug through the Zoom. Another thing that was very painful for people because of grief this year was not being able to be with those family members who died in the hospital of COVID, especially. In our parish, we had over 130 people who died of this, so much trauma of people suffering, very painful. I was with a funeral where the mother, 30-year-old mother died and left 2 kids. People could not travel to come to the funeral. So you can imagine. And then to see the hearse take the body of your loved ones in a gurney, this guy says, it tore my soul to pieces. One of the major factors about grieving has been being alone, feeling all alone and feeling lonely and feeling afraid. In fact, some people say they even sleep with their lights on right now. And then the big factor was that the churches were closed. We're formed for community. Isolation is a big threat for us. And then having the churches closed, isolated us even more from our support groups. It's been a very painful year. I'm just gonna let, I don't know, I wanna answer the other question also, what are we grieving and what's been different? But I don't know, Nancy?
Sure, yeah, no, I'd be happy to chime in here. I think, I appreciate what you put on the table, Arturo, because it really speaks to the stories and the specifics of people's experience of grief. And I think part of what I have been thinking about is that grief this year has meant, for example, an acceleration of violence against women. A lot of us, a lot of communities are feeling enormous pressure, especially with the loss of jobs and the loss of livelihood, a feeling of disorientation that's pretty extreme. And with all of that, it really compounds the stress. And so every time we see stress compounded like this, especially when it's happening in a very large context, it's not just a family here or there, but all of us, that larger social reality has led to an increase in violence against women. So I think there's a way that the tragedy and the grief that we experience compounds evil in all kinds of different ways. I've seen a lot, I'm a university professor. I've seen a lot of students who are very high achieving, used to performing at a very high level, and they just are now lost. They've been lost this last year. They can't think, they can't do their work. So that sense of disorientation. I think the absence of touch, people that live alone, who have not been hugged, or no one has shaken their hand, or there's no even simple kind of gestures of touch that are missing from life. And that, I think, is also a huge part of the experience of grief. And as I look at how we experience grief, I think sometimes it moves us to a place of being frozen in time, that we can't process what we've lost. There's kind of a catatonic sense we feel a kind of a catatonic sense of ourselves. And so that, and then our psychic bandwidth, I think, has shrunk, that we're not able to deal with the normal life stressors and to meet new challenges, where in the past, before this last 14 months, we would be able to handle that. So some of those are ways that I also want to put these ideas on the table as we look at grief. Depression, of course, like all the raw emotion, feeling frozen or flat, or a kind of void in terms of our emotion. For some of us, that has been the case, or an increased sense of anger, I think. So it's thrown our emotions off in a lot of different ways. Physiologically, the grief settles in our bodies, and we feel heavy and tired and achy and slushy and sluggish in a way that we wouldn't normally feel. Or cognitive, we can't pay attention for the same amount of time. It's as if we can't think in the same way that we took for granted before. And while that may be, these descriptors that I've put out there may be individual experiences, I think there's also the collective. So we can't look to our neighbors to help us get out exactly out of what we're experiencing in terms of the grief. We haven't been able to this past year. Now some of that's changing. But my point is simply that the collective, I think, is very important in terms of the depression that many of us have felt. So anyway, that I'll start with that. If you want to, you said you were going to talk more about the feelings, right, Arturo?
No, Nancy, I just keep adding. Claudia asked about what was different about the grief now and before, and some of the things, just to follow up on some of the good points that you make, Nancy, is that now people feel about themselves a little differently because of grief. It's made them question something about themselves that they didn't before. For example, because they feel bombarded with bad news every day, so many more deaths, so many more. The statistics were there every day, even among the kids. They're starting to feel pessimistic and start thinking about the worst. Even people who didn't feel that they were so pessimistic or apathetic before. The media, they feel a tremendous burden. And as a consequence, I think what they're grieving is their own death. they're grieving because death has come to our home. Almost everybody in the parish knows somebody who has died, who is crying, who is grieving right now. And that has put a tremendous burden on the whole community. But we're grieving our own death because it's come to our own homes. The lack of family connection, the lack of emotional support and hugs and human touch, it's one of the greatest threats we have because of the pandemic now. And so we have this sense that we better not waste life. It's too short. It's coming to my home. Someone I know has died. And what about me? Am I next? Because I wear a mask or not wear a mask, or where I go or not go. And that has asked us to look at challenge ourselves in new ways. Let's not waste time. And so from that, a new spirituality has come. And then the question of, what about my faith during this time? What's going to happen? Am I ready when death comes to my door? Am I prepared? What am I going to be? Why is it happening to my family? Why is it happening to me? And that's challenging, very challenging of my faith as well. I see this especially among the youth, but again, the challenge has been, it's everywhere. I'm grieving, I'm crying, I'm tired of crying. When are we going to get over this? And yet something from that says, life is too short, too valuable. We need to move through this to something bigger.
And let me chime in on that, because I agree with you 100%. I think you're absolutely on target with that. And so in the wrestling with this, when we finally can kind of maybe step back a little bit from ourselves and begin to try to get a perspective, which is not easy to do. A lot of us feel kind of frozen, as I was saying a little bit earlier. But when we step back from ourselves, I think the temptation can be towards a kind of despair and a withdrawal from life and the world and from our families, almost just a complete shutdown. And our drive or initiative to be gets compromised, so that's a form of despair. But there's another kind of despair that also can set in here, and I think this second despair is kind of the polar opposite of what I just said. Instead of withdrawing, we can feel a temptation to project our grief out into the world and onto others, as if my grief is the only grief that matters and the whole world is about me and my grief. So even when I step out and try to connect with others, I do so in a way that I can't hear or receive them, because I have an exaggerated sense of my own pain and loss. Not to say, that's not to minimize the loss or the pain or the grief, but it can shut us down where we can't reach out and appreciate that others also have grief that they're experiencing. But underneath those two forms of despair, I think there's even a deeper sense and a longing to have a life that's not so fractured, that has a sense of integration, a certain congruence in life. And this is where the spiritual questions, the theological questions, our faith comes in. That we, if we take seriously our inclination to be to find meaning in life, to find some way of having a congruence in life, then that pushes us to ask questions. Where's God in all of this? And why did God let this happen? And as I say that, for some of us, what we need, I think, is to be able to be angry, perhaps, at God, and God can take that, and to realize, there's nothing wrong with being angry at God for all the tragedy that we have known. But to have God in the middle of that, I think, is a really, really important for us and for our own faith and spiritual growth. And as I say that, I'm thinking about the book of Job, because Job moved in this direction himself, and he knew he had to take it to God, the anger he was feeling and the outrage of all the suffering that he was feeling. And I think many of us, we need to do that. And it's a step towards a longing for some kind of meaning in our lives. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that what your conversation is leading us into are some very interesting questions about what this time has perhaps taught us about the world and about each other and about what the spiritual life is. And also, I think what you're pointing us towards is that it's also teaching us something about what grief is in general. Could you expand on that a little bit? I guess these are theological questions, right? And the question is, has this time amplified or extended our definitions of what these are?
Okay, I can start with what we've learned about the world, and then maybe we can talk about what we learn about each other, and then the spiritual life at the core that grounds the other two questions, actually. One of the key things I think we've learned about the world is that in spite of all the deaths and the bad news we hear, we've seen heroes everywhere, that we have heroes. And that at the heart of who we are, we're good, and that we want to do good, and that we desire to do good, and that we're not going to let death take the best of us. So we have the medics, the nurses, the priests, the women religious, people who have put their lives on the line for others, and they give witness to what's best in our humanity, which is something we need to see right now, to remind us that we're basically capable of tremendous love. And so raising these people up has been a real blessing for us, because it restores our hope that people are basically good and that they've lifted up the best of humanity at a time when we need to see it. The other thing that I think we've learned from the world is that we have seen, because of what's been in front of us, we've been challenged to look at a new consciousness, because we keep talking about, let's get back to normal. And we've discovered this past year that normally was not all that good, especially because people were poor and hungry, and racism, oppressive poverty, the rich getting richer, the poor getting poor, this inequality at all levels of society. And so there's a spiritual calling to say, we need a new normal. We can't go back to the way things were. And so we're challenged now, and the new normal has to be about justice and nonviolence and more communities of hope. I think it's one of the key things. The other thing that I think is really important that has emerged, that we've learned about our world during the pandemic, and Nancy highlighted that a few minutes ago, the importance of our interconnectedness with each other. We are relational people. We're built for community, not for isolation. And the survival of one is the survival of all. And we've learned this in a new way right now. And it's, as Nancy says, cumulatively, it's in every level of society, politically, economically, religiously. And it's going to take all of us to work in a new way together to solve the issues of our time. We can't be selfish. And all of that is in public display now, to be a sign of people who care for the common good. The other issue I think that is highlighted briefly here is solidarity. That if we're going to get out of a new world, a new consciousness, a new way of being, a new kind of person, it's going to be because we reach out to care for each other, especially the poorest among us, and to really make a real serious option for and with the poor. I think that's going to be key, because that's where that's what happens for our personal transformation. Because it's not just about charity, it's about building a different kind of world that's different, that's better and new for everybody. And it's going to take our solidarity with each other, so that I know your plight. I'm not just giving you old shoes or used tennis shoes or a handout, but that I want your life, that I need to question myself at that level of solidarity. Does my lifestyle have anything to do with your suffering? And if it does, then let's do something about it. And let's change it. And that's transformative for both. And then both get to have a different experience of who Jesus Christ is among us. When we have that level of solidarity, we get to see the face of Christ, so to speak, in the sufferings of others. I think that's an important one. And one more thing, that we've learned about the world right now is that racism today and divisions and hate and violence are also part of people's unresolved grief that they've been carrying it. What we don't transform, we transmit. And that's what's being played out in public right now. And it's hurting and causing more grief. And so we need to, as faith people, prophetically focus on building not the American dream, but the kingdom dream among us. And it's more urgent now because it's more evident of the inequalities that are causing so much suffering in our society, and therefore more grief.
Yeah, amen. Amen to all of that, Arturo. I couldn't agree more. I think a couple of things I just want to underscore in what you have mentioned here. I think that our grief and this year that we've been through is a kind of magnifying glass. I think that's a good way to think. It's a magnifying glass because it magnifies what's best in us as human beings and best in the human condition, but it also magnifies our sinfulness and the injustices in our lives. And in many ways, those become much more under the spotlight as a result of what we've experienced over this last 14 years. And I think, as you said, that racism and all kinds of injustices are the product of unresolved wounds of the past. And Pope Francis talks about the need to forgive certainly those who have been unjust and who have sinned, maybe, and we've suffered the consequences of that sin, or we ourselves are sinners. We need certainly to forgive, but he says not to forget. And I think that's very important, to forgive but not to forget. And why? Because that's part of what allows us then to build a different kind of a world where we're not carrying around grief that we haven't processed or wounds that we are still smarting from that come out in ways that are destructive of other people and destructive of our society in all kinds of ways. So in terms spiritually of where we're going, I think right now, one of the things that we need to take account of is this moment is a moment for us to slow down and not to simply leap into, okay, now everything's opening up, so now I'm just going to pick up life as it once was. You're right. It's not a question of going back, but it takes courage. And Pope Francis talks about courage all the time. It takes courage and it takes a willingness to pray. He's been emphasizing, he always emphasizes prayer, but he's talked about the more central import of prayer during this time. And part of that is that I think he's inviting us to slow down and to sit with what we have experienced, the grief that we know and have known, and to slow down and to rethink and to reimagine what God is asking of us now, to reimagine what the future might be. So liberation theologians have often talked about a preferential option for the poor. And yes, we need a preferential option for the poor, but equally important is a preferential option for the future. What is it that we are being called to, and where is the kingdom breaking into our present now? And I think that's another piece of the learning, that we need to allow ourselves to imagine what could be that we don't have at this moment in time, and not simply to leap to the past of what was pre-COVID. And one of the paths for healing our suffering and our grief, like how does one come out of that? And there's a wisdom that's been part of the tradition for forever, and that is the gift of beauty in our lives. That when we know extreme evil, extreme pain, extreme suffering, and the grief is overwhelming, it is beauty that we need to pay attention to, bring into our lives in a more significant way. Not a superficial beauty. I'm living in Los Angeles, and there's so much in this particular city all about image, but this isn't that kind of beauty. We're talking about a beauty that is a beauty that takes us toward to God and takes us to the will to live that God calls us into, and a beauty that unleashes and unlocks that. And I think that's a really important gift always in life, but in a particular way right now. And as I say that, the beauty of other people, the beauty of the natural world. I think St. Augustine said that there are two books of Revelation: the Bible, which we would all say, of course, but the second book of Revelation is the natural world, is the world of nature and the beauty of that. And I think that's one place where we can go to see beauty, to experience beauty, is in the natural world. Anyway, that's kind of a bit far afield, but in reaction to a lot of what you were sharing with us.
Go ahead.
Please go ahead. Go ahead, Monsignor Arturo.
I would just kind of continue your question about what we've learned from each other, and then about our spiritual life. Just briefly about what we've learned about each other. Pope Francis also says, grief can be a moment of grace. And I think grief has brought out some of the best in us, because we get to see each other in the truest self, in our vulnerability, in our hearts being open, and in our tears. That's a grace. And as Nancy brought out, you get to see the beauty of the other person in that, even if it's a moment of pain. So that grief does that for us spiritually. And Hispanics don't sugarcoat the sorrow of death. We have luto. You know what I mean? We never say they're asleep. Ya murió, and makes it more real. The other thing, what we've learned about each other is the importance of depending on one another. We depend on family. We need hugs. We need that touch that's missing in our souls. Our souls lack a sacred embrace. It gives us life, and it sustains us to different, and it gives deeper meaning, that dependency, that we depend on each other. And then it teaches us what we've learned of each other, how to be grateful for each other and for life, that we take too many things for granted. Even a phone call now is important, a card, a meal together. Life is short, life is precious, God is with us. And so it's important to focus on the bigger things and be grateful, celebrate it, even in our sorrow, because sorrow is not the future of our lives. God's new life will always be. And we're survivors. I mean, we're basically survivors. We have a deep, innate desire for more of God and more of life beyond the grief that we carry.
Amen. Amen. And I think so. That is so true. That we're called to certainly take seriously this Holy Saturday moment we're living in. We've been through a kind of Good Friday, and we're now sitting in a Holy Saturday, but Easter is breaking in, and we have to be able to certainly receive and know we're in a Holy Saturday moment. By that I mean that we're still grieving, certainly, and we still feel the loss, but also knowing and with hope in the new life to come. I also think I found it very consoling myself during the past Easter season, how Pope Francis he focused our attention, some of the sermons he gave, on Jesus calming the storm, one of the natural miracles. And I mention that because I think this is another kind of learning for us. We have a lot of anxiety maybe about the situation we're in now and the situation of the world. And the calming of the storm, I think, is a great image and a great passage of the scriptures to help us to move with this situation and a faith in the fact that the storm will pass and that God is with us and that God journeys with us. So that's another piece that I just want to put in the mix here.
I'm kind of grabbing onto to kind of two ideas that have really struck me. The first one is thinking of grief as an opportunity that moves us into solidarity, and also your idea of a preferential option for the future. So if grief is an opportunity for solidarity or an opportunity that moves us into solidarity, and we are to live a preferential option for the future, it seems to me that that presents an interesting perspective into what the spirituality of grief is. That if we are living a preferential option for the future, that sort of gives us a roadmap, so to speak, on how to navigate grief. You know, some of the folks who are with us are also asking a few questions, and I wanted to bring one up, specifically when we're thinking about the preferential option for the future. Two of our audience members have asked questions about looking forward at how grief will extend itself generationally, because people will continue to remember the loss that they experienced in this time. And so how would we navigate grief as we give a preferential option for the future, especially if death has been so close to some?
Yeah. Do you want to? Well, let me. I mean, I think that the loss of people who are in our families. I lost a brother right before we went into COVID, and so I was wanting to be with my parents as we all were grieving his passing, and wasn't able to. And his loss for me, even though he didn't die of COVID, will always be connected to COVID, a much younger brother than myself. And I think you're right. We will always take those, that grief stays with us always. But perhaps what happens in that experience, in that tinge of loss, that we also, over time, can begin to see a sense of hope and a gratitude for the people that were in our lives, like in my case, for this brother of mine who I loved very dearly and still love today. And I think as well, maybe we might take a lesson from our practices of Dia de los Muertos, for a lot of Latinos, Dia de los Muertos, where you see this connection between life and death. And that's one of the great gifts for those of us who are Latinx Catholics, is this connection, and not just for us, but really for the whole Catholic community, the communion of saints that is stretching between this life and the next life. And I think that we are able to navigate our grief when we see ourselves still with a relationship with those who have passed and who have gone on. And we still have this sting of pain, but we also see, we begin to sense a sort of gratitude as we move forward. So those are some of the connections I would see. And that helps us, that gratitude might help us to see how we might live differently and imagine the future in some different ways. But that, I do believe that takes us slowing down and being with God and being in our prayers with God in all that we're feeling.
I want to add to that, Claudia. Nancy's notion about option for the future is a beautiful way to capture something beyond grief. But I want to make sure that we're connected, that the option for the poor is directly related to option for the future. They're not two distinct things, because the future is about hope, and option for the future is about hope. And hope is not wishful thinking. It is the profound conviction that in all things Jesus wins, and that because of that, beyond my grief, beyond my problem, there's going to be a blessing waiting for me to happen. Because even St. Paul said, where there is sin, grace abounds. And that I look for, not wallow in my grief, but that I go through my grief, through it, to a new blessing that is awaiting for me, because I live in hope. But that hope is lived in the way I give hope to others as well. We have to reach out to each other in hope within our grief, because the Good Friday that Nancy was talking about is that when we struggle together with our grief, Easter happens. The grief of the cross happens at the moment of our struggling together. And that's where new life happens to us spiritually. And we can be very confident that we can trust God, that in our humanity, walking hand in hand, in our solidarity, working hand, God affirms our goodness, affirms our dignity, and God nos acompaña. God enters with us. And when God enters that in our journey, struggling against suffering and against grief, the presence of grace is there, and hope is born anew, because Easter happens. That's when Easter happens. It's not just affirming life after death. It's affirming life within death, at the moments of death. And that Easter happens with us. And that's what's happened. And Jesus himself gave us all these words. I will always be with you. Nos acompaña. Be not afraid. My peace be with you. And so the future, as Nancy beautifully placed it is about a hope that we are totally convinced in our faith that in the end Jesus wins, and that when Jesus wins, life happens, new happens. And that's our hope, but it's a lived hope of giving hope to each other in our lives. So as Nancy says, relax, enjoy, have a fiesta, celebrate, dance a little bit more. Don't worry so much. Don't let grief drag you down, as she says. We're people of fiesta, people who have new life. Embrace, hug, love, dance, reconcile, forgive. And in all of that, trust in the goodness of God's promise of new life for you.
Thank you, Monsignor Bañuelas. Another one of our audience members has a question that I think falls in line with this question, with what you just said. Because there's been loss of death, but there's also been loss of ideas or ideals or perceptions of our society. So how do we celebrate a potential future, or how do we imagine a new future when we are grieving the loss of what we thought, for example, our country was, or what we thought our local communities were, or even what we thought our parish was? How do we respond to that kind of loss? Where do we find the celebration and the opportunity?
See, I think it's just what Monsignor Arturo just shared with us, that it's in our connections with one another. And it's in our ability to grieve together, which now is becoming possible again. And in many ways, we have to trust and be patient with ourselves and with where we're headed. And the reason I say that is because at some level, I think about myself. I lost a brother who died very early, much sooner than one would expect a normal lifespan. And in some ways, I felt my grief over this last 14 months for my brother has been frozen. And now, as things are beginning to open up, I think there's ways in which I can feel that loss in a new kind of way, and in the feeling of that, I think that, and sharing that with others, I think we can move forward beyond simply the personal loss, but also when we share the loss that we've been experiencing, to the question more specifically of the ideals or the perception of our church, the perception of our local communities, what our government is, what it means to be a citizen in this country. As we see a loss of a lot of that and what we thought it was, I think that when we grieve with others, we can also imagine a new future that comes from our coming together. So I want to just go back and underscore what Monsignor said, because it has to be in and around how we, it has to be when we connect with each other that we find a way forward. We can't do that by ourselves. We need one another in order for that to begin to manifest for us.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. Also, as people of faith, we need to help each other adapt to the loss of, to live with someone we've lost. You know, we need to be a kind of a church community that's welcoming and understanding and embracing of people, because we're a relational community. And in isolation, it drains us of our capacity to care and to love. And so we need to form the communities, but we need to form communities that were different, because we don't just go back to the pew now that the churches are open. We now say, what does the Holy Spirit want to do new in the church? Because there are some things in the church maybe need to change as well, you know, and make us better. And so we have that abiding trust that the Holy Spirit is still going to do something new in the midst of all of this, because the last word is always Jesus. Jesus wins. Jesus does new life. Jesus resurrects. Easter is happening. And so I think we're at a new age, because we're asking new questions about who we are. We're asking new questions about why our society exists the way it is. Why are people dying? All these new questions that maybe were not part of our dialogue before, were not part of our discussions, but that are necessarily in our discussions everywhere we go, because of the grief we still carry. And because we have new questions, we're going to come up with new solutions, but we're going to depend more in our faith because our faith has tremendous resources for us to live our grief and our spiritual life. Our faith has incredible resources to help us find meaning in the midst of death. So right now, we hold on to the belief that the Holy Spirit is doing something new in our lives, that we can be a better person, that our church can be a better church, and that our society can be a better society. And right now we have the resources of our faith community and each other, as Nancy was saying, that we need to come together, but we need to come together and help people, that there is a loss, that there is a pain, that there's a grief. But beyond that, there's a blessing and a grace.
Maybe just jump in again here, because part of what we've learned, you talking about what do we learn in our parish communities? I think part of my own experience is that Loyola Marymount University has a chapel on campus. We would have mass there every Sunday. But of course, once we went into COVID, that wasn't possible anymore, right? All the masses across the Archdiocese here in Los Angeles, we were no longer having masses in person. And at Loyola Marymount, what we did was to do a liturgy of the word online. And that was done it was done in a way that was, that brought new gifts forward that weren't part of our experience of worshiping together in person. And I learned a lot from the experience of participating in that kind of form of worship over the last 12 months. Or 14 months, really. And so we heard from a number of people breaking open the scriptures from their perspectives, and a lot of different perspectives on this that would not have happened had we not had COVID, for example. And so I had a new experience of being church together. And I'm not saying that this experience is exactly what should continue. I mean, I don't want to go forward with online liturgies forever, but there were experiences that we had that taught me to think about the Catholic liturgy in some new ways, because I was hearing from many of my colleagues as they broke open the liturgy of the word for our community, and they brought different perspectives forward. So that's an example of a learning inside of a particular community that was urged upon us because of being in lockdown with COVID over this last 14 months. So that's one example, I think. And I'm sure there's many examples of learnings in our faith communities over the last 14 months.
Claudia, to respond to your question also, I think one of the things for the spirituality of grief that's very important is that at some point we need to deal with our own death. Real face it, that we're going to die, and are we prepared, or how are we prepared? And then that becomes a liberating experience. And once we're free of the fear of death, we can deal with life in a deeper way, in a more meaningful way. And we're not going to live with fear of all kinds of messiness that we carry in our hearts. But when we're free of the fact that death is not the end of my life, and it's not the worst thing that's going to happen to me. Maybe it's painful for my friends and my family who love me, who want me around, but it's a moment that God fulfills his promise of glory in my life. And so I don't need to be afraid. But we need to be free of that spiritually, to overcome our grief and to be able to help other people with grief. We need to be free of the fear of dying. And I think spiritually, that's an important part for us. And that's going to help us deal with a lot of the things on grief today, spiritually speaking.
Thank you for that. I appreciate you saying that, because I think we take for granted how deeply intertwined fear is with the experience of grief. And that's a good reminder, because it's almost like if we're grappling with grief, we are also grappling with questioning, what is it that I'm afraid of, or what is it that we're afraid of? We have one last question from our audience. And they ask, how do we advance or articulate a hope for the future that you have expressed when they're in the midst of trying to balance a highly politically charged environment? How do they express this kind of faith and social action that you have shared with us today for the common good, and having it be really grounded in a strong spiritual foundation?
Well, one answer I would have to that is the principles of Catholic social teaching. You know, solidarity with others, a preferential option for the poor, the common good. These are all primary principles of Catholic social teaching. Often Catholic social teaching is called the best kept secret of the Catholic Church, because it's basically the social vision for justice in a series of documents that started since the end of the 19th century and up through our own time, calling us to live a more just way. And I take hope in those documents, and they're grounded, obviously, they're part of our faith tradition, but they're also taking seriously who we are in this world that we are living in. And it's a very broad vision of justice. It's a whole garment, as Cardinal Bernardine used to say, of a vision of justice. And I think that is one way that I feel myself grounded today, and yet also able to move towards the future. We are in a very politically charged environment. And at some level, we don't know how it's going to evolve and develop. I mean, I certainly couldn't have imagined the last 8 or 9 years, 10 years ago. But I think we trust in God. We have to trust, as the Monsignor was just saying. And we also have to realize we bring enormous resources from our tradition to the political, to the question of justice in our world. And the resources of Catholic social teaching are central to that. Dr. Ken Himes, who is a Franciscan priest who teaches at Boston College, edited a huge volume that was a survey of Catholic social teaching. I'd recommend that you go pick that up. And there are many, many other scholars, of course, who write and contribute to Catholic social teaching.
And Claudia, yeah, the other thing is, to answer that question, is that we need to live with the hope that God accompanies us at all times. There was a man who had a yellow piece of page, like a normal page that was yellow. And in the corner, it had a purple dot. And he asked 100 people in New York on the street, what do you see? And 100 people said a purple dot. No one said the yellow page. And I think that's symbolic of our spirituality. That purple dot represents the evil, the hate, the racism, the corrupt politicians, you know, all the messiness we see in the world. The yellow page is what God is doing, that God accompanies us, and that God is doing some incredible things in our age. In spite of the death that surrounds us, there's a lot more life. So we need to ask ourselves, where do we stand, in the purple dot or in the yellow page? And if you stand in the yellow page, You're in a company with somebody, and that's where the future is coming, and that's why the future is filled with hope.
Wow. Well, I pray for our presence on the yellow page. I really want to thank you both for the time that you spent with us. On behalf of Commonweal, I would like to thank our audience gathered virtually today. And I also would like to thank you, Dr. Nancy Pineda-Madrid and Monsignor Arturo Bañuelas, for your shared wisdom and your insights on grief in this time of reckoning. We'd also like to invite all of you again to join us the next 2 Thursdays as well, on June 17th and June 24th at the same time, when we'll continue our John Garvey conversations on spirituality in a time of reckoning, where we will be presenting discussions on righteous anger and on metanoia. And I think after today's conversation, we've seen how these experiences are so deeply intertwined. I could feel moments of anger that surface through grief, but also ultimately we're being led into transformation. And so I invite everyone to join us again. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Nancy, Monsignor Arturo. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.